The pallet arrived, mislabeled as flood remediation. 1987. Shrink-wrapped and sweating in the mint cold of the municipal annex, and Jonah Reyes felt the wrongness the way archivists feel mold before they see it. An ache behind the teeth, so he cut the plastic and found heavy ferroglass plates whispering against cardboard, titanium rings etched like wedding bands from machines, and reels stamped in red with a logo whose ink had bled as if time itself were damp. And when he held a plate toward the desk lamp, the image resolved in bands, as if multiple moments had been pressed into one. And there, in a sliver of reflection, a woman in a lab coat stared straight out at him with the poise of someone posing for a photograph that hadn't yet been taken. A hush pooling in the annex as the building's transformer hummed like a throat clearing, and he thought of all the other pallets that never made it past the loading dock, of footage that could erase the comfort of sequence, and of the form he should file to make this not his problem. And then he wrapped his fingers around a tag stamped catenary and a vendor code that mapped in his head to a decommissioned dam he once saw on a field trip. And he knew, with the stubborn certainty of someone who rescues misfiled lives for a living, that if they meant to destroy this, then he had to see what inside it insisted on surviving. He set up the municipal screening room with ceremonial care, threading a salvaged projector and an improvised diffuser so the ferroglass plate could throw its secret onto a thrifted sheet. And as the first frames wavered into clarity, he tasted old acetate and pennies, the image moving with that wrong kind of life that knows you are watching it. A lab corridor funneling inward, until Dr. Mara Iliev turned a camera as if to a mirror, not surprised and not pleased, just present, while a date stamp rolled numbers that skipped ahead like a stutterer who hears the next word too soon. Jonah steadied the focus, scrawled the vendor code again to make it real, and told the empty chairs that some disasters begin with the audacity of a filing error. Framing by frame, he advanced until a reflection in a polished steel panel revealed a line of faces he did not expect. Okoy's profile tight, Quince's papery smile, a young engineer's anxious bite of lip, none acknowledging the hidden vantage. Every detail precise enough to be subpoenaed, and there, stitched between frames like a skipped heartbeat, the corridor lights flickered to a future timestamp for a fraction of an instant, and then returned, and Jonah, who made his peace each day with the small tyrannies of sequence, whispered that the camera had learned to look around corners, and maybe around minutes, and that whoever shot this knew their own destruction would be administrated. He chased the vendor code through municipal procurement like a bloodhound through paper, tags crosswalking vendors that never existed to departments that should buy physics, until the breadcrumb trail resolved into the catenary facility beneath the old dam, and he called a disconnected number that still answered, a woman's measured voice telling him he had misdialed even as she said his name, and the line died with a soft click like a light going off in another room, leaving staring at his own reflection in the dark monitor glass and deciding whether to pack a bag or a shovel. Snow worried the highway lines into soft guesses as Jonah drove toward the dam with the real canisters buckled in like sullen passengers, the motel key digging his thigh, and the radio a low murmur from another decade. When he pulled onto the service road, the spillway rose like a fossilized wave, and a single lamp burned over a personnel door, and he felt the particular courage that comes from having already opened one forbidden box, and knowing the next will be worse. So he killed the engine, let the night press in, and carried the plates toward the place that had tried to delete itself. The catenary screening room smelled of coolant and dust-baked wire as Jonah set the plate on the vitreous recorder's cradle, and Dr. Mara Iliev, summoned from whatever off-grid exile approximated penance, stood with her arms folded like a bridge under load, while Prof. Tau, Harold Quince, found the only chair that creaked, and Captain Lena Okoy watched the door instead of the image. Tara Moralidar tuned the console, a rosary of toggles in her fingers, and the corridor bloomed across the sheet with the authority of a memory that refuses to be only one moment. Numbers chasing themselves in the corner, until they outran the present, and the sound of the loop's old hum bled through tinny speakers as if recorded from a speaker that did not yet exist. And Jonah felt the room inhale when the torus first brightened in the footage, and Ilyev said, almost tenderly, that this was only the dry run, the one they tell committees about because nothing living goes missing. They let the reel spool and spooled their nerves with it, watching the lab team in the image ready the torus for a non-biological throw. A rubber glove clipped to a wire harness like a small white flag, and Quince narrated the science as if telling a bedtime story to a judge while Okoye stood at Jonah's shoulder, and without taking her eyes off the door, said he had 24 hours to pretend he had never seen any of this, and 36 to return the pallet unopened. And Mara, not looking at either of them, murmured that the glove would return, only not where they sent it, and not when they meant, and Tara counted down with the calm of someone measuring the shape of doubt. On screen, the glove vanished with a petulant snap of condensation, and the room stood in the hush that follows a card trick, even as the clock on the wall went on, insisting. Tara tapped her pen against her teeth, calculating nothing useful, and 5 minutes later a clatter from the corridor outside the screening bay made Okoye pivot, already drawing breath for a command she didn't have to give, because the glove lay there on the concrete, like a dog that had found its way home and waited, iced and trembling as if it could shiver, and Ilyev said softly that the anchor had whistled, which meant the loop listened, which meant it could choose its own geometry, if you asked poorly. Back in the bay, they reran the segment and discovered what Jonah had half feared and half hoped. Interleaved among their angles were frames from vantage points they had never set, overhead bird's eye, an impossible low shot beneath a rolling cart, a reverse from the far side of a closed door, each one carrying the same date stamp but the grain pattern of a stock they hadn't loaded, and Quince called it emergent witness, while Tara called it a bug and Okoye called it a liability, and Ilyev, after a long swallow of air that tasted like cold metal, called it what it was, a sign that the recorder was skimming frames off a braid of time where someone had already watched them. They shut the projector and the room felt suddenly prehistoric, the loop's absent hum leaving only the river's dull ache through concrete, and Okoye said the words burn order without heat or threat, just a weather report, while Quince argued that history had brought them a lens to itself, and that to close it would be vandalism. Jonah, who had spent years rescuing births and deeds from mildew, felt the ache of choosing between preserving and surviving, and Tara stared at the glove, sweat thawing on a lab towel, and asked to the air, what happens to a future that already remembers us? Ilyev, who had not yet looked at Jonah as a person in the room, finally did, and told him they were going to do one more run. One he would record with his camera as a control, because if the machine insisted on filming angles they never placed, then they would at least place themselves. They chose the rat because compromise often looks like mercy, and when the carrier slid toward the loop's throat, Jonah filmed from shoulder height as if a steadier angle might persuade reality to behave, while Tara murmured amperages like prayers, and Quince, already rehearsing a paper none of them would dare publish, declared that the anchor tag was a promise rather than a leash. Ilyev's voice cut through the hum with surgical calm as she synchronized the phase ramp, and Okoye, standing behind them with one hand on the cutoff and the other on a sidearm she would never draw on time itself, reminded them that once they started, they were all choosing a jurisdiction that did not recognize appeals. The rat went with a sound like a match blown out, and the loop's frost feathered inward as if cold could inhale. And for 13 minutes they pretended science was patient until a squeal scratched the corridor air and the carrier skittered back unguided. The latch warped as though a hot hand had squeezed it. The animal crouched alive and rigid in a posture no spine should know, and a blackened scrawl along the tag read stop and strokes that vibrated with the projector's flicker when Jonah replayed it, while Ilyev said, very quietly, that they had asked a question of a braid that had learned to answer like a witness, who already knew the verdict. The drone was supposed to be the compromise after the compromise, but its return brought a new violation. A hairline groove along its carbon shell that traced letters none of them recognized until Tara mirrored the footage and found their alphabet looking back from the other side. And Quince declared reciprocity, while Okoye said contamination and Iliev said we proceed, which is when Edda stepped from the periphery, the way climbers materialize from fog, shrugging off her parka like a declaration and tapping the anchor ring against her teeth as if testing a coin. And in the quiet after that sound, she said she would go because she trusted machines more than people, and the first person to flinch would be the one who wanted her to. They dressed Edda in the language of caution. Insulated suit, biometric patches, the anchor's cold circle against her sternum, while Jonah shot steady to fix the moment to something that might refuse revision, and Iliev ran the pre-flight in a voice that had taught undergraduates and consoled widows of failed grants, and Okoye walked the perimeter like a blessing, and Quince made a small cross in the air he pretended was a vector, and Tara, who believed in numbers more than in safety, threaded a new cable as if it were a rosary. When the Taurus brightened to auroral milk, Edda looked back once, practiced a smile that did not betray anyone, and stepped forward into the mouth of her own echo. The departure was clean. No scream of metal, no tantrum of light, just absence shaped like a person, and for a breath, the room steadied. Then the waveform monitors began to pre-lap themselves, registering pulses not yet sent, and a drip condensed on the loop's inner ring that should have been evaporating. 37 seconds later, something re-articulated inside the Taurus, as if the world remembered a pose and tried to hold it. And Edda returned with the posture of someone who had rehearsed being human, her suit scuffed by frost from angles that did not exist, her smile arriving before her mouth decided to make it, and the anchor ring chimed once against her teeth, though she had not moved, and Jonah, without choosing to, lowered the camera as if a priest were passing. Morning came as a bruise across concrete, and they found that the footage had worked night shift without them. The vitreous recorder exposing plates no one had loaded with images from angles they hadn't directed. Small premonitions spliced into the banal. A door yawning before Jonah's hand touched it, a coffee ring helloing the console before Tara set her mug down, a strip of gaffer tape already torn where Okoye would later tear it, and Iliev, whose face kept refusing fear in favor of thinking, said the recorder, wasn't telling the future so much as remembering a braid of choices the room had not yet admitted, while Quince, pleased by any sentence that made the universe sound liturgical, called it foreknowledge, and asked if the machine could be taught hope. The time code betrayed them next, blinking forward by a day during a static shot, and then pretending innocence, and when Tara rolled back frames, the digits flickered to 24, 317, like a clock that had discovered a secret room past midnight. Jonah matched the numbers against his notebook and found a sequence that would put them in the prep bay an hour before they got there, and Okoye's mouth made the shape of a warning before she spoke that nobody used, while Iliev, very calm, asked the recorder for the courtesy of consistency and set a metronome on the console as if rhythm could bracket a phenomenon into staying put. Edda, who now moved like an actor hitting marks someone else had taped, submitted to scans that returned polite refusals to match the data. The facility held on her, dental films showing molars with root architecture no human dentist would claim, microfractures that traced lattices like frost maps of another winter, and Iliev, steadying the radiograph with surgeon's hands. Asked Edda what she remembered between departure and return. Edda mouthed the story of being nowhere in particular with a taste like tinfoil and thunder, then smiled first and let her mouth catch up. And Tara looked at the plate on the lightbox and realized that the crack pattern was a version of the Taurus's magnetic field lines, as if the loop had redrafted her jaw to please its own symmetry. They set up a control, Jonah would film with the consumer cam while the vitreous recorder ran, and the two feeds should have disagreed only in polish. But when they played them back, the plate contained a reverse angle from behind Jonah's own shoulder, a position no camera occupied, and in that phantom view he shifted a second before he actually did, as if the edit bay itself had become a minor deity dispensing prelapse. Okoye muttered that the room was learning them like a security team learns a thief. Quince offered a lecture about causal braids that made the air feel woven, and Iliev, after a long beat, told them to let the recorder finish teaching itself while they audited everything that claimed to be a record. The audit ended where the story began. The municipal pallet, the flood remediation, 1987, lie, and Jonah's proof of custody. But as he laid out the ferroglass plates for a final inventory, he found images of moments they had not yet lived. Okoye signing a burn order with a pen she had not uncapped. Iliev stepping into the loop with the recorder, rigged like armor. Quince weeping quietly over a trash can full of film he would not admit to loving. Tara writing an equation on an index card only to turn it over and find the same equation already there in her own hand. And Jonah sealing a box with tape that hummed like a wasp. The room breathed as if waiting for them to catch up to themselves, and Iliev said, voice level, that evidence had become a place, and they were already inside it. Night recalibrated the dam to an older grammar. The loop coughed itself awake like a furnace. No one had lit. Frost blooming along pipes from the inside out. Moths rehearsing coronations beneath the sodium lamps while Edda walked the catwalks, whispering as if taking attendance of light. Jonah shadowed her with the gentleness reserved for volatile archives, noting how she paused at blank walls, as though listening to a word that hadn't been invented. And downstairs, Tara charted temperature inversions that read like reversed weather. And Okoye ordered a skeleton crew to sleep in boots, because alarms had started pre-lapping themselves by 30 heartbeats, and Iliev, face drained to the intent color of steel, kept her hands near the master switch and pretended that proximity could be control. By midnight, the recorder was laying out tomorrow like a buffet of dread. Plates developing with scenes they had not lived. Okoye locking a cage of canisters. Tara crossing out her own equation only to find it rewritten beneath. Quince weeping into his sleeve before composing his face for debate. Jonah sealing a box and writing a label he hoped would be a lie. Iliev strapping the recorder to her chest with the resignation of someone buckling on a verdict, while the hum of the loop braided with the river's groan, until it sounded like a choir of old machines, and the language of the lab shrank to injunctions and timestamps and the soft, iterative yes of fear. Okoye to the burn without flourish, her voice a ledger line as she read the sequence. Catalog, isolate, demagnetize, incinerate, while Quince's rebellion drained into liturgy, his protests reduced to nouns as he helped number the canisters he loved, and Tara programmed the degasser with the concentration of a surgeon cutting her own palm, and Jonah argued with himself about custody, like a man cross-examining his reflection, and Iliev, unable to find a word gentler than necessary, granted the order with a small nod that redistributed the building's weight to the soles of their feet. When they threw the first switch, the room stuttered like a skipped syllable. The degasser's coil hummed into a flattened thunder, and the projected plate on the wall puckered, its image wrinkling as if the moment were paper, crumpling in a fist. But as the field collapsed, the plate was smoothed and displayed a frame from later that night, Okoye yanking Jonah away from the incinerator mouth. Iliev's face flooded with furnace light, Tara's headset knocked askew, Quince's hand hovering over a reel he could not throw. Edda looking straight down the lens, as if she'd come from behind it, and the present room, chastened by its own preview, held still long enough for the metronome on the console to tick ahead by 3 beats it had not yet earned. They fed the incinerator anyway, because policy is what you do while terror composes an argument, and film buckled in its heat like snakeskin, while ferroglass plates inside turned the color of storm glass and did not crack. And the recorder, left on an empty cradle out of spite or hope, clicked by itself and advanced nothing into something. printing a plate that ghosted the bay with a frame labeled for the next day, showing Iliev walking into the loop with the recorder rigged at her chest, and Jonah's consumer camera aimed in shaky witness, and Okoye, who had placed her faith in procedures that had outlived coups, said stop, in a tone that admitted no timeline where it would be obeyed, and the alarm began to sound from the other end of the building a full minute before anyone could have tripped it. They learned that deletion traveled like weather, sideways, uphill, and into yesterday. Tara demonetized a reel, and a gap appeared 3 months back in an unrelated maintenance log. Okoye cleared a security buffer, and a door camera from last year hiccuped into static where it once held a birthday sheet cake. Jonah, who tested his faith on artifact, drove a knife into it by playing a childhood VHS from a box he kept in the car, breath fogging in the idling cold, and a new figure waited at the end of his familiar hallway with patient posture and no face, then had one. Then had one, as if the tape borrowed what the room offered. And when he returned to the bay with the cassette, clutched like evidence of a crime, Iliev did not try to comfort him, only asked for the length in minutes and whether the counter had ever counted backward before now. Back under the dam, the audit map became a field of small funerals, entries blacking out as if redaction were contagious. While Quince ran a fingertip through gray dust in an empty server bay and whispered that you could measure absence by what it left behind, and Okoye noticed that her after-action reports now contained verbs she did not write yet carried her cadence, and Tara, whose hands shook once and then never again, diagrammed the propagation, each erasure riffling the braid until earlier layers warped to absorb the insult, like bone healing around a shrapnel that refused to leave. Iliev watched the vitreous recorder click frames of the room they were not yet in, and said they had to pin the distortion to something that could choose to hold still. They attempted absolutes. Smash the plates, salt the servers, purge the backups with a procedural ferocity that satisfied no one. Yet the moment the hammer fell, the plate showed a preemptive fracture that healed when it struck, and the backup reported an erase complete timestamp from hours before they initiated it. And Jonah watched his notes rewrite a heading to match a report, not yet drafted, his own hand obedient to a future version of himself. Quince tried humor and found only ash, saying they had innovated a retroactive shredder, while Okoye stripped the room to primitives, paper, light human eyes, and Tara, quiet as an altar, spun an index card to find her equation already copied on its reverse in her handwriting, a mirror with a head start. Iliev said what none of them wanted to hear, that the only still point was a person who would consent to be the nail. Iliev proposed the pinning with the even tone reserved for first-year labs and last rites. She would carry the vitreous recorder into the loop and anchor the braid to her own bio-signature, letting the machine teach itself a stable center, and if it succeeded, the room would remember itself around her, and if it failed, they would at least know who the footage belonged to. Okoye argued in the dry grammar of contingency, then handed over permissions as if tearing cloth. Quince blessed it with a mathematician's benediction. Crossing the air with vector hands he pretended were neutral. Tara stitched telemetry into a harness she designed to feel like a seatbelt for a storm. Jonah loaded a fresh consumer tape and felt the old quiet of witness settle, while Edda helped Iliev shrug into the weight of the recorder, their eyes sharing an expression that arrived before their faces decided to participate. They walked as a procession toward the Taurus, the building obligingly pre-lapping their footfalls on plates set out like stations of a cross. Alarms blinked 2 beats ahead, then waited to be true. The river pressed its voice through concrete as if auditioning for the machine's hum. Iliev paused at the threshold, and with the recorder heavy as a verdict, looked to each of them in a sequence that felt pre-written. The soldier, the archivist, the engineer, the professor, the witness, the echo, and then stepped into the frost breath of the loop as Jonah lifted his camera, and Okoye touched the cutoff, and Tara called numbers that would not stay in place. And Quince said, "Hold," to no one in particular, while Eddie tilted her head to hear the shape of what they were about to become. The loop greeted Iliev like a place that had been waiting for its name to be spoken, the recorder on her chest purring with a confidence none of them shared. And when Jonah lifted his camera, the room's edges softened, as if the image had negotiated softer terms for reality, while the plates on the table exposed themselves in a gentle cascade that arranged their future like a deck a magician wanted them to choose from. Tara called the telemetry until the numbers grew polite and false. Okoi kept one palm on the cutoff and one on her breath. Quince whispered a theorem that meant please. And Edda, echo and witness both, tilted her head in a rhythm that matched the hum as Iliev stepped into the field, with a composure that felt like the last human thing the room would honor. When the field rose, it braided their lives without asking. The lab's caged fluorescence slid into the archive stacks. The motel's neon vacancy bled into the spillways, seems like a wound learning to speak. And Jonah found himself filming from 3 places at once: the bay, the aisle, the parking lot, while his hands did not move. And on a plate that had not yet been developed, Iliev walked past him, and into the older image of a hallway he remembered from childhood, pausing to straighten a crooked frame that had never existed until she touched it. Quince laughed once at the radiance of it, and then covered his mouth. Tara pressed her palm flat to a console that had become a dresser topped with his VHS. Okoye pivoted between 2 doors that were the same door, and Edda breathed in as if scent could tell her which world was ripest. Edda stepped close enough for the recorder to catch a reflection that did not belong to her, a brief angle where her face arrived before its features and then settled with a practiced patience. And she told Iliev that the braid liked her because she never lied to the numbers, which made Iliev laugh once in a way that hurt. And Okoye said the word now with the tone of a door locking, and Tara threaded the anchor lead into Iliev's rig, while Quince read the last line of a proof that ended in the word witness. And Jonah thought of the first day he had opened the pallet and understood that the machine loved custody, not people, which was why it needed a person to hold. Iliev did not look away from Edda when she said, "File me," and the room treated the words like coordinates. The recorder learned to see itself. Plates fanned across the table with frames of Iliev from angles nobody owned, her mouth shaping words a heartbeat before she thought them. And in the best of them, she faced outward toward the operator who would one day find this, and said with deliberate care, "File me," while the metronome on the console ticked a measure that did not exist in any time's signature. Okoye, through the cutoff in the loop, accepted it like a suggestion rather than a law. Tara named numbers that almost held. Quince held his hands apart, as if expecting a bird to alight. Edda counted moths that were not there, and Jonah, dutiful to the last, pressed record with his whole body, feeling the room shift to a line around Iliev, the way a narrative learns its ending and refuses to stop short. After the braid closed, it did not end so much as file itself. The lab relaxed into being only a room again, while the archive reclaimed its mundane dust, and the motel swallowed its neon. And days later, in a municipal annex that smelled of wet cardboard, Jonah sealed a corrugated box with the solemnity of a notary, the canisters and plates inside labeled for destruction with a handwriting that would always look a little like his across history. He listened to the tape hum in the seam like a wasp and thought of Iliev looking out to meet a future she had chosen to own. Of Okoye's steady hand returned to policy, of Tara writing the equation one last time and letting the card keep both sides, of Quince not visiting the river because he had no prayer left for it, and of Edda walking catwalks in buildings that weren't there. And then there came a small, courteous knock from inside the box, and Jonah, sworn to custody, wrote received on the form and did not open it.